what it's like to be abandoned by the Imperium. I remember the sound of the evacuation sirens more clearly than I remember my own mother's face. That piercing wail echoed through the hab blocks for 3 days straight, mingling with the deeper horn blast of orbital shuttles descending through our poisoned sky. The Administratum had declared our world expendable, you see. Not lost, not conquered, but simply expendable. There is a difference, though it meant nothing to those of us who would never see the inside of those shuttles. The difference exists only in ledgers and reports filed 1,000 light years away, stamped and sealed in archives that will outlast whatever happens here. It is a line item in a budget, a calculation of resources versus return, a cold mathematical equation that determines which worlds live and which are allowed to die. Our world had been weighed in the balance of the Imperium's needs and found wanting. They came for the tithe-worthy first, of course. The young and strong who could serve in the guard, the skilled workers for the forge worlds, the Administratum officials and their families who had proven their worth through decades of loyal service. I watched them file past my window in the lower hab. Orderly lines of gray and brown moving toward the embarkation zones like blood cells through veins. They carried what they could, which was very little. You learn quickly what matters when you are told you have 6 hours to abandon everything you have ever known. Holy texts, pictures of the dead, a child's toy. Nothing else burns the same. I saw a man carrying nothing but a faded Aquila pendant that must have been a family heirloom. I saw a woman clutching a box of letters tied with a ribbon, correspondence from someone she loved who was probably already dead. I saw children with their arms wrapped around stuffed animals worn smooth by years of holding, their faces blank with incomprehension, too young to understand their entire world was ending. I had thought I would be among them. I had served the Imperium faithfully for 32 years as a data clerk in the Imperial Census Bureau. My fingers flew across cogitator keys, recording births and deaths, tithes paid and quotas met. 32 years of perfect attendance, of never questioning an order, of processing forms and filing reports, and ensuring every citizen was properly documented and categorized and accounted for. My supervisor had assured me that essential personnel would be evacuated with priority boarding. Essential. That word meant something to me then. It meant I mattered. It meant my service had been seen and valued. It meant the Imperium recognized my contribution and would preserve my life because that life had worth. It meant I would live. I had believed this completely, with the simple faith of someone who has never been betrayed by the system they serve. But when I presented myself at the embarkation checkpoint with my identification papers and my priority evacuation chit, the arbiter behind the reinforced window barely glanced at my credentials, his mechadendrite word as it stamped my papers with a red mark I could not quite read. Vessel capacity reached, he said, his voice flat and mechanical through his Vox grill. Report to secondary holding for next available transport. The next available transport. I clung to those words like a drowning man clings to driftwood. There would be another shuttle. There had to be. They would not simply leave us here. Not after everything we had given. Not after decades of loyal service. I reported to secondary holdings, still believing, still trusting, still certain this was merely a delay and not an abandonment. The secondary holding area was a converted grain warehouse on the edge of the industrial sector. A massive ferrocrete box that could hold 10,000 souls, and now held at least twice that. The air inside was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear sweat. and the chemical stink of portable latrines overflowing in the corners. Flickering lumen strips cast everything in a sickly yellow glow that made everyone look jaundiced and corpse-like. Children cried, old men prayed, women clutched their possessions and stared at nothing. We waited. We waited as the sirens continued their terrible song. We waited as the shuttles descended and ascended, ferrying the worthy to the safety of the void. I found a space near the wall and sat with my small bag of possessions, trying to maintain the composure expected of an imperial servant. That composure was already fraying. A man near the latrines wept uncontrollably. A woman argued with an arbiter about a bureaucratic error in her documentation. Two children fought over a toy while their mother stared at the ceiling with empty eyes. I learned later, much later, that the evacuation order had come from Sector Command after long-range augers detected the arrival of a walk moving through our system. Greenkins. Millions of them in hulking, barely space-worthy vessels that somehow defied every law of physics and common sense. They would hit our world in approximately 270 hours. The Imperium had run the calculations. The cost of defending our world exceeded its value. The manufactorums here were old, their output declining. The population was aging, birth rates falling below replacement levels. The ore mines were nearly exhausted. Our agricultural sector was failing. We were, in the cold mathematics of the administratum, not worth the ammunition it would take to hold this ground. Not worth the ships, not worth the soldiers, not worth anything at all. So they would take what they could and abandon the rest. This is the mercy of the Imperium. This is the love of the Emperor. We were being saved from the burden of continued existence in a galaxy that had no use for us. Better to die here than to consume resources that could be used elsewhere, on worlds that still produced value, on populations that still justified their existence. I understand the logic now. I even accept it in the cold part of my mind that has learned to think like the administratum thinks. But then, sitting in that warehouse, I did not understand. I still believed I mattered. I still believed my life had worth. On the second day in the warehouse, the food rations ran out. The administratum had calculated provisions for a certain number of evacuees over a certain period, and those calculations had not accounted for the overflow, for the desperate masses who had been told to wait. The Arbites came and made an announcement through crackling Vox speakers mounted on the walls. All remaining evacuees would be processed in the order they had registered. Maintain calm. Maintain order. The Emperor protects, but there was nothing in the announcement about when the next shuttle would come. Nothing about how long we would wait. Nothing about what would happen when the orcs arrived, and we were still here, still waiting, still believing our loyalty meant something. The Arbites delivering the message could not meet our eyes. They knew. They knew what we were only beginning to suspect. The fighting started that night. Small scuffles at first, arguments over space or water or nothing at all. Just the pressure of too many people in too small a space with too little hope. I watched a man beat another man to death over a bottle of recycled water. The attacker's face was blank, emotionless, as he pounded his victim's head against the ferrocrete floor again and again and again. I watched Arbites drag the killer away, while the victim's blood spread across the floor in a pool no one would clean. I watched people step over that pool for days, stepping carefully, trying not to slip, until the blood dried to a dark stain, and someone's child drew pictures in it with their finger. Simple shapes, a circle, a square, a stick figure that might have been a person or anything at all. The child's mother did not stop them. No one stopped them. We had bigger concerns than propriety. I tried to leave on the third day. The warehouse doors were locked from the outside, but I found a service entrance, a small maintenance hatch that led to a ventilation tunnel. I crawled through dust and rat droppings and the desiccated corpses of things that had died in the dark. The tunnel was barely wide enough for my shoulders. I could feel the weight of the building above me pressing down and had to fight the panic that threatened to close my throat. I crawled until I emerged into a secondary waste reclamation station and from there onto the streets of the industrial sector. The streets were empty. Everyone was either in the embarkation zones or the holding areas, or had fled to some imagined safety in the hive's depths. I walked through silence, broken only by the wind and the distant sirens and the occasional boom of a shuttle breaking atmosphere. The wind carried ash and the smell of burning promethium. Somewhere, fires were already starting. Somewhere, people were already dying. The slow collapse had begun. I made my way to the central embarkation zone, thinking perhaps I could appeal directly to someone in authority, someone who would see a mistake had been made, that I was supposed to be on those shuttles, that I had served faithfully and deserved better than this. The embarkation zone was surrounded by plasteel barriers and razor wire. Arbites in full combat gear stood at the checkpoints, shotguns held ready. I approached one and tried to explain. He looked at me with eyes hidden behind his helmet's red visor and said nothing. Then he raised his shotgun and pointed it at my chest. "Move along," he said. "Just that. Move along," as if I were nothing. As if 3 decades of service meant nothing. As if the Emperor's love extended only as far as the barrel of his gun. I wanted to argue. I wanted to show him my papers, my service record, my commendations. But the shotgun was steady, and his finger was on the trigger. And I understood that if I pushed, he would kill me without hesitation and feel nothing about it. To him, I was already dead. I was already a casualty. Shooting me would just be updating the paperwork. I moved along. What else could I do? I walked through the empty streets as the sky above turned from gray to dark gray to black. The first stars appeared, though most were not stars at all, but the glinting hulls of ships in high orbit, the evacuation fleet. I could see them up there, bright and clean and safe. And I knew I would never stand on their decks. I knew, though I did not want to know, that I had been left behind. Not by accident, not by mistake, but by design. The administratum had calculated insufficient transport capacity for all personnel. The administratum had run the numbers and found me wanting. The administratum had decided I would die here. A decision made weeks ago, maybe months ago, in some office light years away by someone who had never met me and never would. My death was a line item in a budget. My death was acceptable losses. My death meant nothing at all. I returned to my hab that night. I do not know why. Perhaps because it was the only place left that felt like mine. Even though the Imperium owned it, had always owned it, would reclaim it after I was gone. The power was still on, which surprised me. The door lock still recognized my biometric signature. Inside, everything was as I had left it 3 days ago when I had rushed out with my small bag of essentials. My cot, my shelf of devotional texts, my single chair, my cogitator terminal, my window that looked out onto the hab block's central ventilation shaft. I sat in the chair and stared at the wall. I thought about praying, but I did not know what to pray for. Rescue? There would be no rescue. Mercy. The Imperium's mercy was leaving me here to die. Forgiveness? I had done nothing that needed forgiving, except fail to be important enough to save, except fail to be worth the cost of a shuttle seat, except fail to produce enough value to justify my continued existence. The hab block was not empty. I could hear others moving in the units around mine, others who had also been left behind or chosen not to evacuate or been forgotten in the chaos. We did not speak to each other. We were strangers, united only by our abandonment. Sometimes I heard crying through the thin walls. Sometimes I heard praying. Sometimes I heard the sharp crack of a laser gun as someone chose their own ending rather than waiting for the orcs. Each time I heard that sound, I wondered if I should do the same. It would be quick, it would be clean, it would be on my own terms. But I did not do it. Not yet. Some stubborn part of me still wanted to live, even though I could not articulate why. The water stopped running on the 5th day. The power followed on the 6th. The city was shutting down, systems failing one by one, as the tech priests and servitors who maintained them were evacuated or fled. I sat in my dark hab and listened to the building groan and settle. Without the constant hum of recyclers and generators and ventilation systems, I could hear the structure's bones, the way it creaked and shifted like a living thing or a dying thing. The city was dying around me, and I was dying with it. The air grew stale and thin. The temperature dropped. Condensation formed on the walls and dripped onto the floor in a rhythm that marked the passage of time. Drip, drip, drip. Each drop another second closer to the end. I ventured out again on the 7th day, driven by thirst. The public water stations were still functioning, fed by deep aquifer pumps that would run until the orcs destroyed them. I filled every container I had brought with me, knowing this might be the last time I would have access to clean water. Others had the same idea. We formed a silent queue, not looking at each other, each of us pretending we were alone in our abandonment. An old woman in front of me dropped her container, and water spilled across the permacrete. She stared at it for a long moment, watching her life drain away in liters and milliliters, then simply walked away, leaving the container where it lay. I picked it up. I filled it. I carried both containers back to my hab, water sloshing against the sides, my arms aching with the weight. On the way back, I saw 3 bodies in the street. They had not been there that morning. No one had bothered to move them. No one would. We were beyond such niceties now. The nights were the worst. Without power, the hab block grew cold, the temperature dropping as the heating systems failed, and the planet's natural chill crept in through every crack and seam. I wrapped myself in every piece of clothing I owned, and still shivered. I could see my breath misting in the darkness. I thought about burning my furniture for warmth, but I had nothing to light a fire with and nowhere to safely contain it. So I shivered and waited for dawn, and tried not to think about the fact that each dawn brought me closer to the day the orcs would arrive. I tried not to think about what the orcs would do when they found me. I had heard stories. Everyone had heard stories. The Greenkins did not kill quickly or cleanly. They enjoyed suffering. They took their time. Death would come as a mercy after hours or days of agony. I began counting time by the shuttles. Every few hours, I would hear the distant thunder of engines as another transport descended or ascended. I would go to my window and watch the bright dots moving against the sky. And I would count them. 1, 2, 3, 12, 20. The numbers meant nothing except that they marked the passage of time and the continued evacuation of those deemed worthy. After a while, the shuttles came less frequently, then rarely, then not at all. The sky fell silent except for the wind. The evacuation was complete. The fleet was departing. We had been left behind in truth now, not by accident or bureaucratic error, but in final abandonment. This was our world now, this dying city, this failing hive, and we would inhabit it until we died or something worse happened. The Imperium had washed its hands of us. We were no longer its concern. We had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The gangs formed quickly. When the Arbites evacuated, when the administrative officials fled, when every symbol of imperial authority lifted into the sky and vanished, the social order that had kept us civilized collapsed like a house of cards. Men who had been law-abiding citizens became predators. Women who had raised children became desperate creatures capable of anything. Survival became the only law, and mercy became a weakness that would get you killed. I heard the gangs moving through the hab blocks at night, breaking down doors, taking what they wanted, hurting who they wanted. I heard the screams. I pushed my cot against my door and sat behind it with a piece of broken pipe I had found in the hallway, and I waited for them to come for me. They never did. Perhaps my hab was too high up. Perhaps they found easier targets. Perhaps the Emperor protected me after all, though that protection felt more like neglect than grace, more like being overlooked than being saved. Food became the currency of the new order. I had none. My cupboards had been bare when the evacuation began, and I had not thought to stockpile before leaving for the embarkation zone. Why would I? I was supposed to be on those shuttles. I was supposed to be safe. Now I was hungry, and hunger is a strange and terrible thing. It starts as a discomfort, an emptiness you can ignore. Then it becomes a presence, a gnawing beast in your belly that demands to be fed. Then it becomes everything, the only thing you can think about, the lens through which you see the world. Food becomes the organizing principle of existence. Every thought bends toward it. Every action is calculated by its potential to produce it. I found myself staring at the rats that scurried through the hab block's corridors and wondering if I could catch one, if I could stomach eating it raw, because I had no way to cook it. I found myself calculating the caloric content of shoe leather. I found myself thinking thoughts I would have found repulsive a week earlier. I descended deeper into the hive, following rumors of food stores in the commercial district, places that might have been overlooked in the chaos of evacuation. The hive's lower levels were dark without power, the lumen strips dead, and I navigated by touch and memory and the faint light that filtered down from above. The air grew thick with the smell of rot and waste and something else, something sweet and cloying that I recognized after a moment as the smell of corpses. People had died down here. Whether from violence or despair or simple starvation, I did not know. I stepped over their bodies in the darkness, trying not to think about the fact that I might soon join them, trying not to think about how easy it would be to just lie down in the dark and stop, just stop. But I kept moving. My body kept moving, even when my mind wanted to quit. I found a supply depot that had been partially looted. The locks had been blown off with crude explosives, and the interior was a chaos of scattered containers and broken shelving. But in the back, behind a collapsed storage rack, I found sealed packages of guard-issue rations. They were old, the packaging discolored and brittle, but the seals were intact. I took as many as I could carry, stuffing them into my bag and under my arms, moving quickly before someone else discovered this treasure. On my way out, I saw a man watching me from the shadows. He was thin, skeletal, his eyes burning in a face that was more skull than flesh. He did not try to stop me. He did not speak. He simply watched as I hurried past, and I wondered if he was too weak to fight or if he had simply given up. I wondered which fate was worse. The rations tasted like ash and chemicals, but they were food, and food was life. I rationed them carefully, one package every 2 days, eating slowly to make each meal last, to trick my stomach into thinking it was full. The water I had collected kept me alive, though I had to boil it now over fires I made from broken furniture in the Hab block's courtyard. Others gathered at these fires, drawn by the warmth and the light, and we shared an unspoken companionship born of shared suffering. We did not exchange names. We did not speak of our pasts or our hopes for the future. We had no future. We simply existed moment to moment, waiting for the end. Sometimes someone would share food or water. Sometimes someone would tell a story from before, from when things were normal. But mostly we sat in silence and stared at the flames and thought about nothing at all. The Vox network came back online on the 20th day. I had thought all communication systems would be down with the evacuation complete. But someone somewhere had rigged a broadcast station to continue transmitting. The message was the same one that had been playing when the evacuation began. A recorded announcement from the administratum. Remain calm. Maintain order. The Emperor protects. Evacuation is proceeding according to schedule. Your patience and faith will be rewarded. The words were meaningless now. A ghost transmission from a time when we still believed rescue was possible. But I listened to it anyway. I sat in my dark hab with my decrepit Vox set crackling and hissing. And I listened to those empty promises because they were the only human voices I heard anymore. Because they were proof that humans had once existed here, had once built things and organized things and believed in things, even if those things were lies. Then, on the 21st day, the message changed. The recording cut off mid-sentence and was replaced by something else. Static at first, thick and heavy, and then a voice. Not a recorded voice, a live voice. Someone was broadcasting from somewhere in the hive. "This is Matthias Kahl," the voice said, rough and urgent. "If anyone can hear this, you need to move to the upper hive immediately. The orcs are here. They hit the outer settlements 3 hours ago. They are moving fast. They are killing everything. Get to high ground. Barricade yourselves in. Fight if you can. Die well if you cannot. The Emperor protects, brothers and sisters. The Emperor protects." Then static again, and silence, and I was alone, with the knowledge that the thing we had been waiting for had finally arrived. The countdown was over. The grace period had ended. Now came the dying. I could hear them before I could see them. The sound of their arrival rolled across the city like thunder. A deep, rhythmic pounding that shook the buildings and rattled the windows and made my bones ache. Drums. They were beating war drums, thousands of drums, a cacophony that proclaimed their presence and their power and their absolute joy in destruction. Then came the gunfire, the distinctive chatter of their crude weapons, and the explosions and the screams. The screams were the worst, high and thin and cut short over and over and over. The sound of people dying in terror and agony while I sat in my hab and listened and did nothing because there was nothing I could do. I was not a soldier. I had no weapons. I had no training. I was a data clerk. I processed forms. That was my contribution to the Imperium. And now that contribution meant nothing because there were no more forms to process and no one left to care. I went to my window and looked down into the ventilation shaft and saw smoke rising from the lower levels. Thick black smoke that blotted out what little light remained. Fires. The orcs were burning the hive as they came, not out of strategy, but out of pure, destructive glee. I watched the smoke rise and thought about all the people still down there, still hiding in their habs or cowering in the darkness, waiting for the monsters to find them. I thought about running, about climbing higher into the hive, about finding someplace to hide that the orcs might overlook. But where would I go? How high could I climb? And what would it matter in the end? The orcs would search every level. They would find every hiding place. They would kill everyone they found. It was only a matter of time, so I stayed. I barricaded my door with everything I had. I wedged my cot against it and piled my chair and my few possessions on top, and braced it all with the broken pipe I had kept for protection. Then I sat in the corner farthest from the door and waited. I could still hear them, closer now, their guttural voices shouting in a language that sounded like violence itself. I could hear the sounds of destruction, of doors being smashed in, of furniture being broken, of bodies being torn apart. They were coming up right through the hab block, floor by floor, room by room, killing everyone they found. I could track their progress by the screams, each scream a marker of their advance, each silence a confirmation of death. The hours blended together. I lost track of time. I may have slept, though I do not remember sleeping. I may have prayed, though I do not remember what I prayed for. I sat in my corner with my hands over my ears and tried to make myself small, tried to make myself invisible, tried to make myself not exist. But existence is not something you can simply will away. You are alive until you are not. And I was still alive, still breathing, still hearing the sounds of the slaughter all around me, still waiting for my turn, still knowing it would come. They reached my floor sometime in the night. I heard them moving through the corridor outside, heard them smashing doors and roaring with laughter at whatever they found inside. I heard a woman screaming in the unit next to mine, screaming and screaming until suddenly she was not screaming anymore. I pressed myself into the corner and bit my hand to keep from making any sound. They were right outside my door. I could hear their breathing, deep and rough like animals. I could hear their claws scraping against the metal. I could smell them through the cracks, a stench of blood and sweat and something fungal and wrong, like rotting vegetation, like decay, like death itself had a smell. And this was it. One of them tried the door. The handle rattled. The door shook in its frame. My barricade held. And after a moment, the green skin moved on. Just like that, it moved on to easier prey, to doors that would open, to victims who would not require the effort of breaking through. I had been spared by random chance, by the luck of having a door that was too much trouble to force. This was the Emperor's protection. This was his love. I was alive because a monster had decided I was not worth the effort to kill, because my death would require more work than it was worth. I had survived by being insignificant, by being beneath notice, by being nothing at all. I stayed in my corner for 2 days, not moving, barely breathing, listening to the sounds of the orcs as they rampaged through the hab block and then moved on to other sections of the hive. I did not eat. I did not drink. I did not dare make any sound that might draw their attention back to me. I simply existed in a state of pure animal fear. Every nerve alive and screaming, waiting for death that somehow never came. I pissed myself at some point. I did not care. Nothing mattered except silence except stillness, except surviving the next minute, and then the next, and then the next. When I finally emerged, when the sounds of the orcs had faded into the distance, and I could no longer stand the hunger and thirst, I found a hab block transformed into a charnel house. Blood on every surface, smeared across the walls and pooled on the floors and dripping from the ceiling. Bodies, or what remained of bodies, torn apart with a casual savagery that spoke to the orcs' enjoyment of violence. The woman from the unit next to mine was unrecognizable. A broken thing sprawled across her threshold. I stepped over her and tried not to look, but I could not help looking. And the image burned itself into my mind where it would live forever. Her eyes were still open. Her mouth was still open. She had died screaming. The city was dying. I could feel it in the way the buildings groaned and shifted, in the way the fires spread unchecked through the lower levels, in the way the smoke hung thick in the air and turned every breath into a struggle. The orcs were not occupying the hive. They were destroying it systematically and joyfully, tearing apart everything humans had built over centuries. This was their nature. This was what they did. They were a force of entropy given flesh, a cosmic joke, a nightmare that should not exist, but did and laughed while doing so. And there was no one to stop them, no imperial forces to drive them back, no hope of rescue or salvation. Just us, the abandoned, the expendable, the worthless. I wandered through the ruins for days, scavenging what I could, drinking from broken water pipes, eating whatever I found that seemed even remotely edible. I was not alone. There were others, survivors who had hidden or fled or simply been lucky. We moved through the wreckage like ghosts, avoiding each other, avoiding the orcs, avoiding everything except the base need to survive one more hour, one more day. We did not help each other. We could not afford to. Compassion was a luxury for people who had hope, and we had none. We had only survival, that most primitive instinct, that biological imperative that keeps organisms moving forward, even when forward leads nowhere good. I saw what the orcs did to those they captured. I saw the cages they built from scrap metal and bone. Cages filled with humans they kept as toys or food or entertainment. I saw the fighting pits they dug in the city squares, where they made prisoners fight each other while the greenskins cheered and placed bets. I saw the crucifixions, humans nailed to improvised crosses made from hab block supports, left to die slowly while the orcs howled with laughter. This was their idea of joy. This was their culture, and there was no one to stop them, no righteous fury of the Imperium to punish their wickedness, no justice to balance the scales, just suffering, endless and meaningless, because suffering amused the orcs and nothing else mattered. I thought about suicide. I thought about it often in those days, standing at the edge of some great height or holding a piece of broken glass to my wrist, or considering the various ways I could simply end the nightmare. But I did not do it. Not out of courage or faith or hope, but out of simple biological stubbornness. My body wanted to live even when my mind did not. My body kept breathing and eating and drinking and running from danger. Even as my mind screamed that it was pointless, that we were all dead already, that survival was just a postponement of the inevitable. There was no logic to it, no reason, just the blind insistence of flesh that it continue existing. The orcs eventually moved on, not because they had finished with the hive, but because they grew bored with it. They were nomads, wanderers following their war boss to the next fight, the next world, the next chance for violence. They left behind a city in ruins, fires still burning, corpses rotting in the streets, the few survivors emerging from hiding to find themselves lords of ash and bone. We were free, if you could call it that. Free to starve, free to die of disease or exposure or despair, free to exist in the ruins of everything we had known. The orcs had taken everything except our lives, and they had left those only because they forgot to finish the job. I made my way to what had been the city center, where the great imperial cathedral had stood. The orcs had pulled it down, of course, toppled the spires and smashed the statues and defiled the altars. But the crypt beneath had survived. And in that crypt, I found others. 20 of us, maybe 30 survivors who had gathered in the one place that still felt holy, that still felt like it might hold some protection. We made a camp in the darkness, lighting fires from broken pews, rationing the water that seeped through cracks in the stone. We told ourselves we were waiting for rescue, for the Imperium to return, for someone to remember that we existed. We prayed together, reciting litanies we had learned as children, finding comfort in the familiar words, even though those words had proven hollow. But no one came. Days became weeks, became months, and no one came. The orcs were gone, but the damage they had done was permanent. The hive was uninhabitable, its systems destroyed, its population decimated, and we were simply not important enough to save. The Imperium had already written us off, had already moved on to other worlds, other battles, other calculations of worth and expendability. We were a footnote in a report filed somewhere, a number in a ledger, casualties acceptable and expected. Our deaths had been budgeted for. Our suffering had been anticipated. We were proceeding exactly according to plan. Food ran out. Water became scarce. People died, and we buried them in the crypt's deeper chambers, adding to the countless dead already interred there. The group grew smaller. 20 became 15, became 10, became 5. I was one of the 5. I do not know why I survived when others did not. I was not stronger or smarter or more faithful. I simply kept breathing, kept moving, kept existing in defiance of every reason to stop. Perhaps that was my curse. Perhaps I was meant to witness everything, to survive everything, to carry the memory of our abandonment forward into whatever future awaited. We heard the ships before we saw them. A deep thrumming that shook the ground, felt more than heard. The sound of massive engines breaking atmosphere. For one wild moment, I thought it was rescue. I thought the Imperium had returned. I climbed out of the crypt and looked up at the sky and saw them descending through the smoke and clouds. Ships, huge ships. Not Imperial vessels, but something else. Something darker, all spikes and angles and malevolent geometry. I knew what they were before my mind could name them. I knew in my bones, in my soul, in the deep primal part of me that recognizes predators. Chaos. The word came to me unbidden, pulled from half-remembered sermons and propaganda vids. The arch-enemy, the great betrayer, the forces that had turned from the Emperor's light and embraced damnation. They had come to claim what the orcs had left behind, to plant their flags in the ruins and corrupt whatever remained. I watched them land and wondered if this was worse than the orcs or simply different. I wondered if I would die screaming or if they would offer something else, some terrible bargain, some transformation that would end my humanity but preserve my existence. I wondered if it mattered. I did not run. Where would I run to? I had been running for months, and it had gained me nothing. I simply stood there in the ruins of the cathedral and watched the chaos forces emerge from their transports. They were men, or had been men once, twisted now into something else. Their armor covered in blasphemous symbols, their weapons crackling with unholy energies. They moved through the city with purpose, not the random destruction of the orcs, but a deliberate claiming, marking territory, establishing bases, preparing for whatever dark work they had come to do. This was not invasion. This was occupation. They had come to stay. One of them found me. I did not hide. I did not fight. I simply stood there and waited as the Chaos Marine approached. His armor the color of dried blood, his helmet fashioned to resemble a skull. He looked at me for a long moment, and I looked back and I felt nothing. No fear, no hope, no despair. I was empty, hollowed out, a shell that still breathed but held nothing inside worth preserving. I had been emptied by months of suffering and abandonment until I was nothing but a biological machine, still going through the motions of existence. "You survived," he said, his voice distorted by his helmet's vox. It was not a question, but a statement tinged with something that might have been surprise or respect or mockery. I could not tell. I did not care. "Yes," I said. "Do you wish to continue surviving?" I thought about the question. I thought about the months I had spent hiding and scavenging and watching people die. I thought about my life before the evacuation, my 3 decades of service to an Imperium that had abandoned me without hesitation. I thought about the Emperor's love that had manifested as neglect, and the Emperor's protection that had meant being left behind to die. I thought about all of this, and I realized I did not know how to answer. Survival had become a habit, not a choice. I survived because I did not know how to stop. "I do not know," I said finally. The Chaos Marine laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "Honest," he said. "I can work with honest." He reached out with one massive gauntleted hand and gripped my shoulder. And I felt something flow into me, something that was both fire and ice, pleasure and pain, corruption and promise. "You will serve," he said. "You will find purpose. You will find meaning. The false emperor abandoned you, but the true gods welcome all who come to them, all who embrace what they truly are." I should have resisted. I should have spat in his face and died a martyr to the emperor I had served all my life. But I did not. I was too tired, too broken, too empty. And some part of me, some small dark part that had been growing since the moment I realized I had been left behind, whispered that he was right. The Emperor had abandoned me. The Imperium had deemed me worthless. Why should I remain loyal to powers that had shown me no loyalty in return? What did I owe to a system that had used me for 32 years and then discarded me like trash? So, I nodded. I accepted. I let the corruption flow into me and change me and make me into something else. It hurt. It hurt more than anything I had ever felt, like my body was being torn apart and reassembled from the inside out. I screamed, and my screams echoed through the ruined cathedral. And I knew that I was damned, that I had traded one master for another, that I had given up my humanity for the promise of purpose and meaning and continued existence. But the pain brought clarity. The corruption brought truth. And in that truth, I understood that I had always been damned. The Imperium had damned me the moment it calculated that I was not worth saving. The Emperor had damned me the moment he allowed the shuttles to leave without me. My damnation now was merely the physical manifestation of what had already happened to my soul. But I was alive. After everything, I was still alive. The Imperium had left me to die, but I had refused to die. The orcs had tried to kill me, but I had hidden and survived. And now the forces of chaos had found me and offered me a choice. And I had chosen to live, even if the life I chose was damnation. Because life, any life, was better than the death the Imperium had sentenced me to. Because existence, even corrupted existence, was an act of defiance against the system that had tried to erase me. Because I would not give them the satisfaction of dying quietly and being forgotten. This is what it is like to be left behind on a doomed planet. This is the Emperor's mercy. This is the Imperium's love. You are expendable until you are not. You are faithful until faith means nothing. You are human until humanity becomes a burden too heavy to bear. And then you become something else. And you tell yourself that it was choice, that you made a decision, that you had agency in your own fall. But we both know the truth. I was abandoned. I was left behind. And in the end, I embraced damnation not out of malice or rebellion, but out of simple, desperate exhaustion. The Imperium made me what I am. The Emperor's failure made me what I am. And as I stand here in this ruined city, wearing armor that once belonged to a loyalist, bearing marks that burn my flesh with holy corruption, I wonder if this is not exactly what was always meant to happen. If the Imperium's cruelty is not designed precisely to create monsters like me. If every world they abandon is not a garden where damnation is carefully cultivated. If the Emperor himself does not look down from his golden throne and smile at the efficiency of it all. At how his abandonment feeds the enemy. At how his rejection creates the very traitors he claims to fight. Perhaps this is the true genius of the Imperium. Perhaps we are not mistakes, but products, not failures, but inevitable outcomes of a system that grinds souls into dust and harvests whatever grows in the ruins. I serve new masters now. They are no kinder than the old masters, no more merciful, no more concerned with my individual worth. But at least they do not pretend. At least they do not speak of love while demonstrating indifference. At least they are honest in their malice. And perhaps that honesty is itself a kind of mercy. Though it is a mercy that tastes like ashes and smells like burning flesh, and feels like the slow corruption of everything I once was. They use me. They consume me. They will discard me when I am no longer useful. But they will never lie to me about it. They will never tell me I matter while proving I do not. This is my confession. This is my testimony. This is what it is like to be left behind on a doomed planet in the 41st millennium. You wait for rescue that never comes. You watch everyone you know die. You survive through luck and stubbornness and the simple biological imperative to keep breathing. And when something darker than the death you expected offers you a choice, you take it. Because damnation is better than oblivion. And service to evil is better than meaningless extinction. Because at least in damnation, you matter enough to be corrupted. At least in service to the dark gods, you have value. Even if that value is measured in suffering and sacrifice, and the slow erosion of everything you once believed. The Emperor protects. They told us the Emperor provides. The Emperor loves his faithful servants. But I was faithful, and I was abandoned. I served, and I was left behind. I believed, and I was betrayed. Not by the ruinous powers, but by the Imperium itself. And that betrayal, that abandonment, that final proof that my life meant nothing to the forces I had devoted it to, That is what broke me. That is what made me into this. That is the real horror of the 41st millennium. Not the monsters in the dark, but the indifference of the light. Not the enemies of mankind, but mankind's treatment of its own. Not the corruption of chaos, but the calculated cruelty of the Imperium that drives souls into chaos's waiting arms. I am still here. I am still alive. I am still breathing in this poisoned air and walking through these ruined streets and serving masters who at least acknowledge my existence. And every day I wake and remember who I was and who I am now. And every day I wonder if there is any meaningful difference between the two. I was a slave to the Imperium. I am a slave to chaos. The collar has changed, but the collar remains. The only difference is that I no longer pretend it is not there. The only difference is that I no longer believe the chains are for my own good, that the suffering has meaning, that the sacrifice serves some greater purpose. I know now that I am nothing, that I have always been nothing, that the Imperium and chaos are simply two different ways of using nothing until it is used up. This is what it is like. This is the truth they do not put in the imperial primers or the propaganda vids or the sermons delivered in cathedrals that tower over worlds. This is the truth they do not want you to know. That the Imperium's love is indistinguishable from its hate. That its protection is indistinguishable from its abandonment. That its mercy is indistinguishable from its cruelty. And when you realize this truth, when it is burned into your soul by being left behind on a dying world, you become something else, something darker, something damned, something that understands that the difference between servant of the Emperor and servant of the dark gods is merely a matter of which lies you still believe. But at least you're still alive, to be damned. At least you still exist. And in this galaxy, in this grim darkness where there is only war, existence itself is a victory. No matter how corrupted, no matter how fallen, no matter how far from the light you have descended, I exist. I survived. I endure. And if that endurance requires damnation, then so be it. The Emperor had his chance to save me. He chose not to. So I saved myself, at the cost of everything I was and everything I believed. And I do not regret it. How can I regret choosing existence over oblivion? How can I regret refusing to die for masters who had already decided I was not worth saving? This is my confession. This is my testimony. This is what it is like to be left behind. Remember it, whoever finds these words. Remember that every time the Imperium abandons a world, every time they deem a population expendable, every time they run their cold calculations and find people wanting, they create monsters. They create me. They create thousands like me. Survivors who learn that loyalty means nothing, that faith is rewarded with betrayal, that the only truth in this universe is that you are alone and you must save yourself by any means necessary. Every abandoned world is a recruitment center for chaos. Every evacuation that leaves souls behind is a gift to the dark gods. The Imperium sows the seeds of its own destruction. Every time it proves that its citizens are nothing but numbers in a ledger. The Emperor protects, but he did not protect me. And so I learned to protect myself. And in learning that lesson, I became something he would destroy if he could, but he cannot. He is far away on Terra. A corpse on a throne, sustained by the sacrifice of psychers he would have called abominations. Ruling an Imperium that perpetuates itself through the same cruelty that created him. And I am here, alive and damned, and still breathing, still existing, still surviving in defiance of everything that tried to kill me. This is my victory. This is my damnation. This is what it is like to be left behind. And if you ever find yourself in my position, if you ever feel the Imperium's love manifest as abandonment, if you ever realize that you mean nothing to the powers you have served, remember my words. Remember that survival is its own justification. Remember that existence, even corrupted existence, is a rebellion against the forces that would erase you. Remember that the Imperium creates its own enemies, one abandoned soul at a time, and that every monster serving chaos was once someone who believed in the Emperor and learned better. This is the truth. This is the lesson. This is what it means to be left behind. And this is why chaos will never die, because the Imperium will never stop creating us.